My name is Natalie Vance, and for 10 years, I was the perfect political wife. I was told my role was to be a silent, smiling accessory, a beautiful portrait hanging in the background of my husband's brilliant career. They called me emotional. They called me a liability. They never once imagined that my feelings were actually meticulously gathered data, and that this data would one day become the weapon I'd use to dismantle a political dynasty from the inside out. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's a story about the moment a porcelain doll discovers she's made of solid steel. Before I get into the exquisite detail of how a single, 7-word whisper on live television ended my marriage and launched a war that would play out on the national stage, I'd love to know where you all are watching from today. Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you've ever been underestimated or told your greatest strength was a weakness, do me a favor and hit that like button. For those of you who are new here, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell, because this is a community for people who know the power of rewriting their own narrative. Now let's go back to the beginning, to the gilded cage I once called home, and let me show you how the whole glittering facade was built on a foundation of lies. It all started with a man I loved, or at least, the man I thought I knew. When I first met Michael Vance, he wasn't yet the political juggernaut he would become. He was a junior state legislator with a fire in his eyes and a mind that seemed to move at the speed of light. I was a policy analyst for a nonpartisan think tank, a woman who lived and breathed data, who found stories in spreadsheets and truth in statistical trends. We met at a policy conference, not a fundraiser. He wasn't interested in my dress or my smile. He was captivated by a rebuttal I delivered to a panelist on urban revitalization. He cornered me afterward, a notepad in his hand, his eyes alight with genuine curiosity. "That point you made about tax incentives versus direct investment," he'd said, "I've never heard it framed that way. Show me your numbers." For the first 2 years of our marriage, that was our dynamic. We were a team. Our nights were spent not at lavish parties, but spread out on the living room floor, surrounded by policy briefs and electoral maps. He would talk about his vision, the broad, beautiful strokes of the world he wanted to build, and I would provide the architecture, the data, the framework that could make it a reality. I wasn't just his wife, I was his secret weapon, his most trusted advisor. He would look at me across a pile of papers, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across his face, and say, "Nat, you see things no one else does. You're my strategic vision." And I believed him. I loved that version of him, the man who saw my mind as my most beautiful feature. I didn't realize that our partnership had an expiration date, one that would coincide with the arrival of his family into the core of our lives. The Vances were not just a family, they were a political institution. His father, Judge Arthur Vance, was a retired appellate court justice, a man whose quiet, assessing gaze made you feel as though you were perpetually on the witness stand. His mother, Eleanor Vance, was a former state senator herself, a woman who had sacrificed her own national ambitions for her husband's career and was now determined to project them onto her son. She was a formidable matriarch, carved from marble and political savvy, and from the moment Michael's career began its steep ascent, she saw me not as a partner for her son, but as a variable to be controlled. The shift was subtle at first, a gentle sanding down of my edges. "A little less analytical, dear," Eleanor would say, her hand cool on my arm during a fundraiser. "More warmth. The voters connect with heart, not with statistics." Michael, who once celebrated my mind, started to echo her. "She has a point, Nat. You can be a bit intimidating with the facts. Just feel the room." The phrase, "just feel," became a constant refrain, a gentle but persistent dismissal of the very thing he'd once admired. I was being remolded, reshaped from a strategist into a symbol. The first time it truly stung was at a dinner party at his parents' estate. The room was filled with donors and political power players. The topic turned to a contentious infrastructure bill. I had spent the last 2 weeks analyzing its potential impact, uncovering a critical flaw in its funding mechanism that would disproportionately affect low-income districts. When there was a lull in the conversation, I saw an opening. Actually, I began, my voice clear and confident. The bond issuance outlined in Section 4 has a problematic precedent. In a similar 2008 project in a neighboring state, the projected revenue fell short by 32%, leading to a service tax hike that. Eleanor's laughter cut through the air, light but sharp as shattered glass. "Oh, Natalie, darling," she cooed, placing her hand over mine on the table. "Let's leave the dreary policy talk to the men, shall we? This is a party." The table chuckled politely. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck. I looked to Michael, expecting him to defend me, to say, "No, let her finish, she's brilliant." Instead, he just smiled his perfect, political smile and patted my other hand. "Yes, honey. You're right, Mom. This is a celebration." He then turned to the table. "Natalie is organizing the most wonderful charity gala for the Children's Literacy Fund. Tell them about the theme, Nat." My throat felt tight. The carefully constructed argument in my head, the product of hours of work, dissolved into a cloud of shame. I was being told, in the kindest, most patronizing way possible, to be quiet and perform my designated role. And I did. I smiled, and I described the centerpieces and the color scheme for the gala, my voice sounding hollow and distant to my own ears. I could feel Judge Vance's eyes on me from across the table, a look of cool approval on his face. I had passed a test. I had learned my place. That night, driving home in silence, Michael finally said, "You were great tonight." They loved you. He didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, that they didn't love me. They loved the version of me they had created, the version that knew when to be silent. This dynamic only solidified as his campaign for the national stage began in earnest. I was formally excluded from the strategy meetings. The campaign manager, a gruff, old-school political operative named Richard, was a loyalist to the Vance family. He treated me with a sort of bemused tolerance, as if I were a child who had wandered into the adults' table. But I couldn't turn off my brain. I continued my research, my analysis. I saw a weakness in their approach to the western counties, a block of voters they were writing off as a lost cause. I spent a week buried in demographic data, voter histories, and local economic reports, and I developed a 5-point outreach plan that focused on local industries and community leaders. It was solid. It was innovative. I found Michael alone in his study one night, looking exhausted. I nervously presented my proposal, laying the papers out on his desk. He looked them over, a frown creasing his brow. "Nat, this is a lot." Before he could say more, Richard walked in. He glanced at my papers, then at me, and let out a short, huffing laugh. "What's this? The First Lady's platform?" He picked up a page, scanned it, and tossed it back on the desk. "Too complicated, Natalie. Way too in the weeds. We need a simple, strong message. A banner, not a blueprint." I looked at Michael, my heart pounding. This was his chance to stand up for me, for our old partnership. "Let's hear her out, Richard," he could have said. But he didn't. He just sighed, rubbing his temples. "He's right, Nat. You're overthinking it. It's about a feeling, a connection. Not this." He gestured vaguely at my carefully researched plan. I watched as Richard gathered my papers, squared them up neatly, and placed them on a side table, a stack of irrelevant thoughts. They were never mentioned again. My world began to shrink. The part of me that analyzed and strategized went dormant, or rather, it went underground. I poured that intellectual energy into things they approved of. I organized the most successful fundraising events in the state's history, not through charm, as they called it, but through meticulous data analysis of donor patterns and targeted, personalized outreach. I ran our household with the efficiency of a corporate CEO, managing complex schedules and logistics that would make a general proud. But they saw none of that. They saw a beautiful home, seamless events, and a charming hostess. They praised my natural talent for entertaining, my woman's touch. Every compliment was a quiet erasure of my skill, my intellect, my labor. I remember one event in particular, a sprawling fundraiser at a historic museum. The fundraising goal was ambitious, set by Richard with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Just get close, Natalie. The optics are what matter." But I saw a path to not just meeting it, but shattering it. I spent weeks building a donor profile database, cross-referencing public records with past political contributions and philanthropic interests. I designed a tiered ticketing system with targeted perks that appealed to specific donor psychologies. I orchestrated a silent auction that used dynamic pricing models based on real-time bidding data I monitored from a tablet hidden behind a floral arrangement. The event was a staggering success. We didn't just meet the goal, we exceeded it by 40%. The papers called it a triumph. As the last guests departed, Michael wrapped his arm around me, beaming. "You did it, honey. You charmed the entire state. I don't know how you do it." His mother, Eleanor, was even more effusive. "Such grace, Natalie. You have a true gift for making people feel at ease. That's your magic." I just smiled, a hollow feeling echoing in my chest. My magic wasn't grace, it was Gaussian distribution models. My charm was a well-executed algorithm. But I didn't correct them. What was the point? I had begun to internalize their narrative. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was my lane. Maybe the part of me that craved a seat at the strategy table was the part that was wrong, too ambitious, too much. I started to believe it. I started to doubt my own perceptions. Was I being too sensitive? Too emotional? The word emotional became their favorite weapon. Anytime I expressed a dissenting opinion, frustration, or even just exhaustion, it was deployed with surgical precision. Don't get emotional, Natalie. Let's not let our emotions cloud the issue. It was the ultimate shutdown, a way of invalidating my thoughts by recasting them as irrational feelings. I grew quieter, more isolated. The woman who once debated policy with fire and precision now spent her days discussing flower arrangements and guest lists. The only place my mind was still truly my own was late at night, after Michael was asleep, when I would open my laptop and lose myself in the world I used to inhabit, the world of data, strategy, and cold, hard facts. It was my secret rebellion, a way of reminding myself that the woman they had buried was still alive. The intellectual chauvinism wasn't limited to his mother. Michael's father, the Honorable Judge Arthur Vance, had his own methods of putting me in my place. He enjoyed setting little intellectual traps for me during their suffocating Sunday dinners. He viewed the world through the lens of jurisprudence, and he seemed to take a perverse pleasure in trying to expose my supposed intellectual inferiority. He knew I didn't have a law degree, and he used it as a cudgel. "Natalie," he said one evening, pausing with his fork halfway to his mouth. "Michael tells me his opponent is making noise about corporate liability reform. It brings to mind the precedent set in Palsgraf v. Long Island Railroad. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of proximate cause." He said it with a thin, knowing smile, as if he were a professor quizzing a particularly slow student. The entire table went quiet, watching me. He expected me to stammer, to demur, to say I wasn't familiar with it. But this was my turf, in a way. Policy analysis is deeply intertwined with legal precedent. "Of course, Judge," I replied, my voice even. An interesting case, but one could argue that a more relevant precedent for this specific legislation would be McPherson v. Buick Motor Company, which shifted the burden of liability away from privity of contract and towards a broader duty of care. The opponent's proposal seems to be built on a McPherson framework, not a Palsgraf one. They're arguing about the inherent danger of the product, not an unforeseeable chain of events. A flicker of genuine surprise, quickly masked by annoyance, crossed his face. He hadn't expected a substantive answer. He'd expected a vacant smile. "A novel interpretation," he said stiffly, before turning his attention back to his son. "Michael, about that endorsement from the police union. I had won the point, but I had lost the game. I had failed, once again, to be the simple, pliant woman they wanted me to be." I could feel Eleanor's gaze on me, cool and disapproving. That night, Michael said, "You know, you don't have to debate my father. It makes him uncomfortable." "He started it," I whispered. "It doesn't matter," Michael replied, his back to me as he undressed. "Just let him be right. It's easier." It was always about what was easier for them. My intellectual integrity, my very sense of self, was a small price to pay for their comfort. The gilded cage was getting smaller, the air thinner, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that I was slowly suffocating. The turning point began, as so many things did, with another woman. Her name was Isabella Rossi. She was a state senator from the other side of the aisle, but this was a primary, and she had declared her candidacy to challenge Michael for the party's nomination. She was everything I was being told not to be. She was fiercely intelligent, unapologetically ambitious, and she wielded facts and figures like a weapon. She had a law degree from Yale and a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. She didn't soften her edges or try to be warm. She was a force of nature, and I was secretly, deeply in awe of her. Of course, the Vance family and their political machine despised her. All head, no heart, Richard, the campaign manager, grumbled in a meeting I was allowed to sit in on, but not speak in. The people won't connect with a robot. Michael laughed. She's cold. Abrasive. We'll paint her as an out-of-touch elitist. Easy. Eleanor was the most vicious. A woman like that has no place in public service. She's sacrificed all her natural femininity for ambition. It's a sad, empty way to live. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. They were criticizing Rossi for possessing the very qualities they had systematically stamped out in me. My late-night research sessions took on a new focus. It was no longer just a hobby to keep my mind sharp, it became an obsession. I wasn't just analyzing policy anymore. I started analyzing Michael. I knew him better than anyone. I knew the tells he had when he was bluffing on a policy point, a slight tug on his left earlobe. I knew he had a deep, almost phobic avoidance of discussing healthcare specifics because his knowledge was embarrassingly shallow, propped up by a single, aging advisor with outdated theories. I knew he had a profound, buried insecurity about never being as intellectually rigorous as his father, and that he could be triggered into making rash, overly aggressive statements if he felt he was being perceived as weak or ill-prepared. I started a file. A simple, password-protected document on my private tablet. At first, I told myself it was just an intellectual exercise, a way to game out the campaign. I titled it Vance Campaign, Vulnerability Analysis. I documented every weakness, every tell, every psychological trigger. I cross-referenced his public statements with his private admissions of doubt. I detailed the way he would use charm to deflect any question that required depth, the specific phrases he used as conversational smoke bombs. I wrote down the childhood anecdote about a sailboat race he had lost, the one his father still told at parties to needle him, the one that could still, to this day, make a muscle in his jaw twitch with resentment. The file grew, week by week, into a comprehensive and devastating portrait of the man behind the curtain. It felt like a betrayal, but it also felt like the only truly honest thing I was doing in my life. Then came a strange, hopeful reprieve that made the ultimate betrayal even more brutal. Michael's polling numbers began to slip. Rossi was hitting him hard on economic policy, and his canned, feel-good responses weren't working. The gap was closing. The campaign was in a quiet state of panic. One night, he came into my dressing room, his tie loosened, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. He looked like the man I had first married. He sat on the ottoman at my feet, his head in his hands. "I don't know what to do, Nat," he confessed, his voice small. "She's got me pinned. Nothing worth throwing at her is sticking." He looked up at me, his eyes pleading. "What's your gut feeling? Just, what do you think?" My heart ached for him. My gut feeling was a 6-page analysis I had already prepared, complete with polling crosstabs and a detailed communication strategy. I hesitated for only a moment, then I went to my closet, pulled out the hidden file, and laid it out for him. "It's more than a feeling, Michael," I said softly. "Here's the data. You've been framing the debate around national job growth, but the key demographic you're losing is suburban homeowners concerned about property taxes. Rossi is hitting you on federal spending, but you can pivot, and you can corner her on unfunded state mandates. Here's how. For 2 hours, we worked like we used to. We sat on the floor, he listened intently, he asked sharp questions, he treated me like his partner. He absorbed the strategy, made it his own, and the next day, he deployed it. It worked. It worked brilliantly. Rossi was caught off guard. The media narrative shifted overnight. His numbers rebounded, soaring 5 points in less than a week. For 7 glorious days, the old Michael was back. He held my hand in public and private. He looked at me with that old, familiar admiration. "You were right, Nat," he whispered in bed one night. "You're my secret weapon. Always have been." A fragile, foolish hope began to bloom in my chest. Maybe we could get it back. Maybe he finally remembered who I was. The campaign called a press conference to celebrate the triumphant polling numbers. I stood beside him, my heart full. This was our victory. A reporter from a national paper asked the inevitable question. "Congressman Vance, that was one of the most masterful pivots we've seen this election cycle. You completely reframed the economic debate. What was the secret? What changed?" This was it. This was his moment to give me credit, to show the world we were a team. Michael chuckled, a warm, self-deprecating sound that the cameras loved. "Well, I have to credit my whole team. They work tirelessly," he said, giving the standard political answer. "But sometimes, at the end of the day, you just have to trust your gut." He then turned, looked directly at me, and placed his hand on the small of my back. "And my wife, well, she's my good luck charm. Always has been." He winked at me. My smile froze on my face. A good luck charm. A rabbit's foot. He had taken my intellect, my work, my strategy, and reduced it to a superstition. He hadn't just taken credit, he had erased my contribution entirely, recasting it as some kind of vague, feminine magic. In that moment, the fragile hope that had bloomed in my chest withered and died, turning to a cold, hard stone of certainty. The lead-up to the first live, televised debate against Isabella Rossi was suffocatingly tense. The polls had tightened again. Rossi was a formidable debater, and this was Michael's chance to land a decisive blow or suffer one. The Vance household was a pressure cooker. The night before the debate, I was getting ready when Arthur, the campaign manager, found one of my research printouts, a comparative analysis of Rossi's voting record, that I'd foolishly left by the communal printer in the home office. He didn't go to Michael. He came directly to me, holding the papers like they were contaminated. "Natalie," he said, his voice low and firm, his eyes holding no warmth. "This is cute, but it's not helpful." He didn't even look at the content, just the fact that it existed. "You are distracting him. Your job is not to be his think tank. Your job is to be his rock. The smiling, supportive wife who believes in him unconditionally. That's what the voters need to see. That's what he needs. Stay in your lane." He dropped the papers on my vanity table, next to my jewelry. The message was clear. Stick to the accessories. Later that evening, Eleanor summoned me to the library. She was sitting in a large leather armchair, a glass of sherry in her hand. "Natalie, dear," she began, not inviting me to sit. "Tomorrow night is pivotal. Michael is prepared, of course. He is a Vance." She took a delicate sip. "I need you to understand your role. It is a very, very important one." I waited. "Your only job tomorrow night, your entire purpose for being on that stage, is to look adoringly at your husband. When he speaks, you must be captivated. When she speaks, you must look concerned, perhaps a little sad for her. When the camera is on you, you must radiate wifely devotion. That is how you will help him win. Do you understand?" It wasn't a question. It was an order. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The perfect political wife. The porcelain doll. Tomorrow night, I would play my part one last time. But I was starting to realize that even dolls, when pushed too far, can break. The air in the television studio was cold and smelled of stale coffee and ozone. The lights were blindingly hot, a constellation of artificial suns designed to expose every flaw, every bead of sweat, every flicker of doubt. I was positioned in my designated spot, a chair just off to the side of the stage, but deliberately placed in the front row of the audience, perfectly in Michael's line of sight. A strategic prop. I was wearing a sheath dress in a shade of cobalt blue that the campaign stylist had called reassuring but not distracting. My hair was perfect. My smile was polished. I was the very picture of serene, wifely support. From the outside, I was a statue. Inside, a storm was gathering. The debate began, and Michael was in his element. He was all charm and charisma, deploying broad, inspiring strokes about the future, family, and freedom. He was masterful at creating an emotional connection with the audience, making them feel his ambition was their ambition. Beside him, Isabella Rossi was a study in contrast. She was cool, precise, and utterly relentless. She didn't offer platitudes, she offered facts. She spoke in paragraphs backed by citations, her arguments built brick by brick with irrefutable data. As Michael painted a picture, she provided the stark, black and white blueprint that revealed its flaws. I watched them, a strange sense of detachment washing over me. It felt like I was watching the two halves of my own brain argue with each other. The strategist versus the symbol. For the first hour, they parried back and forth. Michael would land an emotional jab and Rossi would counter with a statistical uppercut. The momentum shifted with every exchange. Michael was holding his own, but I could see the strain. He was used to opponents he could fluster or charm into submission. Rossi was immune to both. She wasn't debating the man, she was dismantling his arguments. Then, she saw her opening and she took it. "Congressman Vance," she said, her voice cutting through his latest soaring rhetoric about fiscal responsibility. "You speak of being a guardian of the taxpayer's dollar, yet you've conveniently omitted your record as a state legislator. Specifically, the 2014 Pioneer Grant Program for Tech Startups. Could you please explain to the voters why, under your oversight, that program had a 78% default rate on its loans, resulting in a 9-figure loss for the state, a fact documented in the State Comptroller's audit, report number 3B. 74. Silence. It was an obscure but devastatingly effective blow. It wasn't a matter of opinion, it was a recorded, audited fact. The moderator, smelling blood in the water, turned to Michael. "Congressman?" Senator Rossi raises a specific point. "Your response." I saw it. A flicker of pure, unadulterated panic in Michael's eyes. It was gone in a nanosecond, replaced by his practiced, confident mask, but I saw it. He didn't know the report. He had no answer. He started to bluff, tugging at his left earlobe. The tell. He launched into a rambling, generic defense about the importance of investing in innovation, completely sidestepping the core of her question. But Rossi didn't let him off the hook. She pressed, citing another detail from the audit. The moderator pressed him again. Michael was cornered. He was drowning under the weight of facts he had never bothered to learn. And in that moment, as Rossi was delivering her follow-up, my mind, that part of me they had tried so hard to silence, ignited. I knew the rebuttal. I had stumbled upon it weeks ago during one of my late-night research sessions. The Pioneer grant failure was real, but the audit also contained a buried addendum, an economic impact study showing that 2 of the surviving companies from that program had gone on to create thousands of jobs, ultimately contributing more in tax revenue than the initial program had lost. It was a complex, nuanced defense, but it was factually sound. It was the checkmate move. Breaking every rule Eleanor had laid out for me, I leaned forward. The cameras were on Rossi. Michael glanced at me, his eyes wide with desperation. I leaned as close as I dared, my hand shielding my mouth, and I whispered the 7 words that could save him. Cite the net long-term fiscal impact. I gave him the 2 company names and the job creation number. It was concise. It was powerful. It was the truth. He heard me. I saw the understanding dawn in his eyes. I saw the relief. He had the lifeline. He could use it, win the point, and turn the tables completely on Rossi. He could show that he had a deep command of the details. He could win the debate. But then I saw something else flicker across his face. Pride. Arrogance. The voices of his parents, of his campaign manager, whispering in his ear. The humiliation of being saved by his emotional wife on national television was, in his mind, a fate worse than losing the point. He straightened his shoulders. He turned away from me and gave the audience a wide, patronizing smile. He reached over and patted my hand, a gesture of condescending affection for the cameras to capture. Then he leaned into his microphone, his voice dripping with the false sincerity I knew so well. "My wife," he said, his voice booming through the studio and into millions of homes. "She feels things so very deeply. A beautiful, beautiful heart. The audience murmured, unsure how to react. But let's stick to the facts, shall we? He then pivoted to another weak, generic talking point, completely discarding the perfect, fact-based rebuttal I had handed him. He chose his pride over the truth. He chose to humiliate me rather than accept my help. In that instant, everything went silent for me. The noise of the debate, the heat of the lights, the presence of the crowd, it all faded away into a muffled hum. All I could feel was a profound, arctic cold. The porcelain doll didn't just crack, she shattered. The camera briefly cut to me, and I know what it must have captured. My face was a blank slate. The polished smile was gone. The adoring gaze had vanished. There was no emotion at all. Only a look of absolute, chilling clarity. This was the end. I stood up. My movements were calm, deliberate. I didn't look at Michael. I didn't look at the cameras. I simply turned my back on the stage, and with a quiet dignity that felt more powerful than any outburst, I walked away. I walked down the aisle, through the double doors at the back of the studio, and out into the cool night air. The sound of my heels clicking on the pavement was the only sound in my world. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I was never, ever going back. I found a nondescript hotel 20 miles away and paid in cash. The moment I closed the door to the small, anonymous room, my phone began to explode. First Michael, then Eleanor, then his father, then Richard. A relentless barrage of calls and texts. I looked at the screen, at my husband's name flashing over and over, and felt nothing. I turned the phone off and dropped it into my purse. I turned on the hotel television and watched the post-debate analysis. The pundits were alight with speculation. Michael's performance was judged as weak, faltering. But the real story was my exit. They showed the clip of me walking away again and again. Was I ill? Was it a marital spat? A sign of campaign turmoil? An hour later, Michael's campaign released an official statement. We can confirm Natalie Vance was feeling unwell this evening and left the debate to rest. She is her husband's #1 supporter and looks forward to joining him back on the trail tomorrow. The gaslighting was instantaneous and absolute. I wasn't a person who had made a choice. I was a woman who had come down with a case of the vapors. I was not a strategist who had been publicly humiliated. I was a delicate flower who had wilted under the lights. I turned off the television. The silence of the room was a comfort. It was the first real silence I had experienced in years. For 2 days, I remained in that hotel room, living on room service and newfound clarity. I had a lawyer draw up divorce papers. I methodically separated my finances. I was building a fortress, brick by brick. On the 3rd morning, I turned my phone back on. Amidst the hundreds of frantic, angry, and pleading messages from the Vance camp, there was one new email. The sender was an encrypted, anonymous address. The subject line was simply, the debate. My finger hovered over it before I opened it. The message was short and direct. I saw the debate. I saw the whisper. Then I saw you walk away. I have a feeling you're the person we need. Let's talk. Rossi. My heart began to pound, not with fear, but with a thrilling, dangerous sense of possibility. I agreed to a meeting. Not with her campaign manager, as I had expected, but with Senator Isabella Rossi herself. We met in a private dining room of a quiet restaurant far from the political heart of the city. She was dressed in a simple pantsuit, no makeup, her hair pulled back. She looked more like a professor than a politician. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She slid a tablet across the table. It was a high-resolution video of the debate, zoomed in on Michael and me. She played the moment of the whisper, then the moment of his dismissal. I had my team of lip readers analyze it, she said, her voice even. You gave him the perfect rebuttal. Cite the net long-term fiscal impact. You gave him the company names. You gave him the job numbers. He had the winning move, and he threw it away to publicly pat you on the head. She looked at me, her eyes sharp and assessing. I don't think you're emotional, Natalie. I think you're the smartest person in his entire operation, and he was too arrogant and too stupid to see it. She leaned forward. My campaign is solid, but we're missing an edge. We're fighting a brand, a dynasty. We need someone who knows the brand from the inside. Someone who knows where all the cracks are in the foundation. Then came the offer, more audacious than I could have ever imagined. I want you to be my campaign manager. I was stunned into silence. Me? Campaign manager? I'm not. I don't have the experience, I stammered. Rossi smiled, a quick, genuine flash of a smile. You have 10 years of experience in the most brutal political training ground there is, the Vance family. You have the data. You have the strategy. I've seen your fundraising models. My team has been trying to figure them out for years. I don't want your gut feelings, Natalie, she said, her voice laced with a fine, sharp irony. I want your brain. The one he threw away on national television. Come work with me. Let's show him what a real fact-based campaign looks like. In that moment, I felt a decade of suppressed ambition, of intellectual frustration, of quiet rage, coalesce into a single, sharp point of purpose. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclamation. It was about taking back the part of myself that I had allowed them to bury. Yes, I said, my voice clear and steady for the first time in days. I accept. The next day, my lawyer filed the divorce papers. 30 minutes later, the Rossi campaign sent out a press release. The headline was an earthquake that shook the political landscape to its core. Natalie Vance files for divorce, joins Rossi campaign as campaign manager. The blowback from the Vance camp was immediate and apoplectic. They released statements calling me emotionally unstable, vindictive, a scorned woman lashing out. But their attacks backfired spectacularly. Juxtaposed against the image of me walking calmly away from that stage, their vitriol made them look like panicked bullies. They were proving my point for me. The public, especially women, saw it for what it was. The narrative wasn't scorned wife. It was woman who has had enough. And they were right. The war had begun, and I was finally in command. The war room of the Rossi campaign was my natural habitat. It was a chaotic, beautiful mess of whiteboards covered in scribbled notes, monitors displaying shifting poll data, and the constant, buzzing energy of people driven by a singular purpose. For the first time in a decade, I felt like I could breathe. I wasn't a symbol. I was a commander. I wasn't emotional. I was surgical. Isabella gave me complete autonomy, and I used it to weaponize my intimate knowledge of my husband. I was the architect of his rise, and now I would be the architect of his fall. My first move was to exploit his deepest insecurity, his terror of being unprepared. I had Isabella and her surrogates start dropping hyper-specific, obscure policy questions into every interview and town hall. Questions about agricultural subsidies in a specific county, references to footnotes in trade agreements, queries about local water rights regulations. Michael, who relied on broad charm and a handful of well-rehearsed talking points, was repeatedly caught flat-footed. He would stammer, deflect, and tug on his earlobe. We had a running montage of it on our campaign's social media feed, titled Just the Facts, set to circus music. Next, I went after the dynasty. I knew Michael secretly chafed under his father's shadow, but publicly leaned into the image of a political legacy. I crafted an ad series that was devastatingly simple. It showed a picture of Isabella, the daughter of a stonemason and a seamstress, who had worked her way through college and law school. It then cut to a picture of Michael as a boy on a yacht with his senator mother and judge father. The tagline was stark: Isabella Rossi. Self-made. Michael Vance. Handed down. The ad never mentioned me, but its DNA was mine. It struck at the core of his manufactured, man-of-the-people image. The most effective weapon, however, was the one he had handed me himself. We produced a 30-second spot that opened with the now infamous clip from the debate. Michael's voice, dripping with condescension, but let's stick to the facts, shall we? It was immediately followed by a rapid-fire succession of news clips of him getting facts wrong, of fact-checkers rating his statements as pants on fire, of him fumbling answers to the specific questions we had been feeding the press. The ad ended with a simple, black screen and white text: Isabella Rossi. She knows the facts. It was brutal. It was effective. And it was, from my perspective, pure justice. The final debate before the primary vote was a slaughter. Michael walked onto the stage looking like a ghost. He was pale, thin, and the easy charm had been replaced by a haunted, defensive energy. He had been dismantled, piece by piece, by a strategy that knew his every move before he made it. Isabella, armed with my playbook, was calm and confident. She cornered him on his disastrous healthcare proposal, using the exact critiques from the outdated advisor I knew he relied on. As he floundered, I watched from the control room, a headset on, a monitor showing a dozen camera angles. He kept looking out into the audience, his eyes scanning the crowd. I knew who he was looking for. He was looking for me, the prop, the reassuring smile. But I wasn't there. I was in Isabella's ear, the voice of strategy, the whisper of truth. For the final blow, I gave her the kill switch. "Now, Isabella," I said calmly into my microphone. "The sailboat." The childhood anecdote his father always tells. Isabella nodded almost imperceptibly. During her closing statement, she looked at Michael with something that looked almost like pity. "My opponent talks about leadership," she said, "but true leadership isn't about having the right last name. It's about resilience. It's about learning from your failures, not pretending they didn't happen." She paused. "It's about not getting so angry that you break your own rudder just because you're losing a race." It was such a small, specific, personal detail. To the audience, it was a strange metaphor. To Michael, it was a sniper's bullet. I saw his face crumble. The public mask fell away, and for a split second, the world saw the insecure little boy who could never please his father. He never recovered. He lost the debate, and 3 days later, he lost the primary in a landslide. The victory party at the Rossi headquarters was electric. The screens all showed Michael giving a stiff, bitter concession speech, his parents standing behind him looking shell-shocked. In our war room, someone popped a bottle of champagne. The sound of it echoed the moment my old life had officially ended and my new one had begun. My team, my brilliant, loyal team, hoisted me onto their shoulders, chanting my name. I looked out over the sea of cheering faces, and I didn't feel the sharp, triumphant glee of revenge I might have expected. Instead, I felt a deep, quiet calm. My vindication wasn't in his spectacular failure. It was in my own quiet, undeniable success. A year has passed since that night. Senator Isabella Rossi is one of the most respected new voices in the Capitol, and I am her chief of staff. My office is not a gilded cage, it's a place of purpose. Michael has faded into obscurity, taking a consulting job at a firm owned by one of his father's friends. I hear he's dating a woman who is, by all accounts, very beautiful and very, very quiet. I wish them well. His life is no longer my concern. My journey was a painful one, but it taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. For years, they told me my greatest weakness was that I was too emotional. They were wrong. My sensitivity wasn't a weakness, it was a sensor. It was the tool I used to gather data, to see the truth behind the smiles, to understand the motivations that drove people. My feelings weren't the opposite of facts. They were data with a soul. I was never just a political wife. I was a strategist, a leader, a fighter. I just had to burn down my old life to realize I was waiting for the right campaign all along, my own. They tried to put me in a box, to define me by my relationship with a powerful man. But what they failed to understand is that being underestimated is a secret superpower. They never see you coming. So I want to leave you with this thought. If someone in your life is trying to dim your light to make theirs seem brighter, it's not a reflection of your worth, but of their fear. Don't let them win. Your voice matters. Your mind matters. Your feelings are your facts. Thank you so much for joining me and listening to my story. I've seen so many of you sharing your own experiences in the comments, and it's incredibly powerful. If you've ever had to fight to be seen for who you truly are, please share your story below. Let's make this a space where no one feels invisible. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and please subscribe to the channel for more stories about reclaiming your power. Remember, the most important campaign you will ever run is the one for yourself. Thank you for listening.